Camilla, can I please have a roll call of members?
Mr. Francis, Mrs. Irwin Adams, Mrs. McGinnis,
Here.
Mr. Mignon,
Here.
Mr. Cook, Mr. Pacifico,
Here.
Mr. McCauley,
Here.
Mr. Pappas,
Here.
Mr. Romanowitz.
Here. Thank you. I'd like to announce prior to the meeting, we did engage in an executive session to discuss personnel issues. That being said, we can move on to what we're here for tonight. Special presentation. I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thank you, sir. Tonight, we would like to review the updated state budget funding for 24-25. Obviously, we pass a budget in June of each school year. And then we are at the whim of the state as to when their budget is passed. So in terms of understanding and knowing what our exact allocations are, we make our best educated guess, and we were formally informed of our budget allocations in August with the passing of the state budget. So with that being said, I want Camilla and Mrs. Franks to go over what our allocation is and what our options and plan are for spending this year.
Thank you, Brad. I'm going to share my screen and project the. We're not projecting. We'll go, it's going to be shared on YouTube. So let me start from the beginning. You have the PowerPoint at your desk, and there's also a very large piece of paper, but to be able to review 20 years worth of basic ed funding and block grant funding needed to be on a piece of paper this wide, so it wasn't too small. So we'll get started. We're going to review what the state did for us this year, which is amazing. We'll review what we did in June on PowerPoint page 3. The budget that was passed was with a $1.5 million deficit, and that included a 5% tax increase. Our index, the Act 1 index was 7.7. We went 5% from 6.7502 mils to 7.0877, and it raised about 1.1 in local revenue. So that's included in this slide 3, the $1.5 million deficit. Oh, did I not share it? I'm sorry. I need technical assistance. Nick's helping me. Thank you, Nick. So also presented in, that's what Sue presented in June, was our capital reserve 5-year plan. And we have several projects that we are covering. And you may remember that we received a state grant that will help cover part of that intramural field project, the $810,000. So we did receive some state funding to help with that, but there are still several other projects, this is on slide 4, that we still need to have funded. So here is the estimated increase in state revenue. It's never finalized until the end of the year, but this is what they have projected for our appropriation. And it is great news, but is it sustainable? We received another $118,000 in our basic ed subsidy, $215,000 in our special ed subsidy. They're throwing some money out for cyber charter funding. They've estimated they're going to change the way the formula is when we have to pay the cyber charters. And based on what they think our change will be, they estimate that we will save approximately $322,000. That will be determined. We'll keep you posted on that as to whether it actually shakes out that way. But the big winner was the adequacy funding. And you may remember that a lawsuit was brought against the Commonwealth for not funding education appropriately. And the judge ruled that they needed to fund schools to cover education. So our portion is $3 million. But instead of giving it to us in basic ed subsidy, where we have full control over how we're going to spend it, and would give me a little more confidence that it was going to last, they put it into the block grant, Ready to Learn, and there are strings attached with Ready to Learn. There are only certain things that school districts can use Ready to Learn funds for. So on the next slide is a list of all the things that are approved to be used for Ready to Learn funds. And I know they're small. It's I can give you a printed copy of it that lists it all, but the highlighted areas are what we propose to use the funds for, to relieve the budget and free up money. We had already budgeted for full day kindergarten. We had $1.4 million in the regular Ready to Learn that was funding about 60% of full day kindergarten. So with this extra 3, we propose to fund the rest of full day kindergarten. And also math and literacy programs, school library materials, Leader in Me falls under the work-based or experiential learning and career readiness programs. One thing that they did change that worked in our favor was programs for instruction on world languages. Ready to Learn used to only allow us to use it if we expanded it in elementary schools. Well, they took the elementary requirement off, and so now we are proposing to use it for our secondary world languages. So if you go to the next slide, it's a summary of what we propose, and we will have to put it into the application to PDE, and they're going to have to approve it. And the last one for GACTC, $740,000 toward that tuition, that's what we're going to propose, but I don't really know if PDE will approve it. If it fits, they gave some very broad general guidelines, and I can't really tell whether it's going to fit. So we'll give it a shot and hope that it flies. If it doesn't, on the slide before, the last one that they added was a use for increases in charter school tuition costs, back to that long list. What does that mean? It's increases in charter school costs. They're giving us a break that they're estimating $322,000. So are we going to have increases? And there's no guidance, there's no explanation on what that means. So the General Assembly made the law, and then PDE has to try to figure it out, and how is it going to work? And Ready to Learn the application was open, and then they closed it until they worked some of these out, and they just opened it back up last week. So we have this loaded, and this is our plan to submit, and then we'll let you know if it passes or if they approve it. On slide 8, one of the important pieces that I think we need to remember is, if you look at the 20-year history of the block grant funding, when it first started, it was all political. They took a portion of what was basic ed subsidy and they set it up into this block grant funding, where they put the strings on into the areas that they wanted, that were important to the politicians who got it passed. They gave us in 2006-07, we were 1.5 million. Then it went down in 2011-12. It went down to 566,000. It's a nebulous number. It has been steady since 2016, 17 at 1.485. They haven't given us more. They haven't taken any away. But I think it's important to remember that at one point, they did take it away. They took $1 million away and they kept it we were $1 million lower for several years. That same graph or that same line chart is on your big paper. And it's this orange line at the top, and you can see the actual amount of funding and then and this demonstrates how it fluctuated. This is where they put the adequacy funding. This is what makes me nervous about counting on it. The graph at the bottom shows our basic ed subsidy, or shows basic ed plus block grant funding, and they cut our basic ed funding in 2009, 10 and 10, 11. Those 2 years, they cut our basic ed funding by $4.7 million. So it seems to sometimes be cyclical. So right now we're at the last several years, if you look at our basic ed funding, it's creeping up. They're funding us. But history shows that it's possible that they can come in and cut it. So I think what I'm trying to say is I've been here a long time. I've seen us go through some good times and think we're finally there. This is great. And then they pull the rug out from under us. So plan ahead cautiously. You can't count on this extra $3 million being there next year. It's a great thing for this year. It helps this year a lot, but it is yet to be determined whether it will continue, whether they'll find the money for the adequacy funding moving forward. And that's what everything we heard in the budget meetings as well was. They didn't want to project it out because where's the money going to come from? On slide 10, that just shows where we lost 3.2 million, 1.4 million. Then it jumped up, then they made up for it, part of it. Then they gave us no extra money in 12-13. There was also during COVID 2021, we got no extra money in basic ed subsidy or in Ready to Learn. So it's a great year, but I think we need to just plan on it for just this year. Slide 11 shows how they've funded us compared to the consumer price index, which the consumer price index line is the black line. And it's, as you can see, it's been relatively steady. And the green line is where our state funding is. It was below, started creeping back up. 1 year it was way over, but most of the years it's below what the consumer price index is. So when they give us more money, it's not really enough to keep up with inflation. Another place that we did receive more money, I'm on slide 12 now, is our special ed subsidy increase. That will help cover some of the additional special ed positions. We added an autistic support position in May of this year. In November of 22, we added a life skills support position. And in May of 23, we added speech and language support and autistic support. So that 215 will go a long way to help defray some of those additional costs. But we still have a $9 million deficit between special ed funding overall and special ed expenditures. So it was helpful, but not nearly helpful enough. Slide 13 is showing, this is what I was referring to on the cyber charter tuition costs. You can see it's gone up and down, and last year it was at $4 million. If we don't go above, if the Ready to Learn is only for cyber charter increases, we'd have to go above $4 million to be able to use it. That's why we've chosen not to include it in the Ready to Learn until they tell us we can't use it for the career and tech tuition. And I blasted through it quickly, and I know there are a lot of questions. Or Brad, if you have anything to add or point out.
No, I think just to kind of, explain, so with the additional money that we have, we're able to utilize the additional money that we have to fund programs, expenditures that were already in the budget. So what that will do is that we'll leave a surplus that we can decide how we want to allocate once we get confirmation of the funding and the actual numbers as to where they are. Potentially, we could look at committing that money to capital reserve, which is always a good thing, especially when you look at the short 5-year and long-term needs within the districts they're going to hit us relatively quickly. We've been very fortunate this year through a lot of hard work of a lot of people to secure grant funding money, which is helping to offset over half of the wall project, in addition to some of the other initiatives that we have. Remember that anything that we add, and we're not advocating for any ads, it's looking at utilizing the money that we have to supply things that we've already budgeted for, which would then free up money to then be allocated to specific things moving forward. So even though this money may be one and done, if we do it correctly and we do it properly, we are able to then commit money to future and long-term endeavors, primarily in the capital reserve. And again, I know it was a lot to put out at this point. But again, it's good news, but it's cautionary in terms of, we did receive additional funding, more than we had budgeted and we're expecting. It's going to allow us to do some things that are important in the short term and in the long term. But we cannot rely on that money being an annual allocation. We have to treat it as what it is, which is a 1-year allocation, and make sure that we're utilizing it, wisely. And I hate to use the word, but we're investing it. And we're investing it by allocating it and designating it in certain ways.
And we've approached it similarly to the way we approached the ESSER funds, that we knew they were going to go away. We tried to make smart decisions on where those funds were used and try to extend our fund balance as long as possible.
Is it going to cause much of a additional burden for the business office? Is there more reporting required because of the imposition of all these?
We tried to keep the list short and keep it as simplified as possible. So it didn't take me long to go through and figure out how much the world languages salaries and benefits cost. Haley gave me the list of the instructional support staff. We picked up those salaries and benefits. If they are approved, we'll go in, change their account numbers. They'll all get charged to that. And if the money goes on for next year, then those would already be budgeted for the future. Or if it goes down, then we could decide which one would go back to local and which one would stay in Ready to Learn. But Haley does the programmatic side, and there is some reporting on that.
It has not been too cumbersome because we've only had kindergarten in there. At this point, it doesn't look like it's going to be too cumbersome, but with the additions and with the reporting changes, we'll see. They've not released all of those things in good fashion, just as they do. They release the money with the requirements, but not necessarily all of the reporting that goes into it. So if it stays the same as it has, it should not be too cumbersome, with what we've chosen.
If we submit it this week, I would expect within a couple of weeks, they'll usually with the other grants, they kick it back. They review it and kick it back within a couple of weeks and say, you need to revise. That would be my expectation.
We feel that what we're submitting falls well within the guidelines that they've outlined as to what's going to be approved. We've, as outlined in that one slide, we have about 5, 6 big chunk items that we're going to submit for approval. And everything that we can see, all of those pieces fall under the approved list. And, as Haley had mentioned, if we're able to have our list limited to those 5 or 6, the management of those funds will not be too much in terms of little over 3.
If we free up $3 million that was budgeted in local, then we could transfer that. If we end up with a surplus, we could transfer that to capital reserve. Similar to what we did with ESSER.
And similar to what we did last year. So we, after audit findings in December, January, we had a revenue over expenditure from the previous year. And we were able to look at, I think it was a little over 5. We were able to look at that number. Was it 5? Oh, it was over $1 million last year, but the previous year. So we're able to look at that closeout and then make an allocation of that revenue over expenditure. So what Camilla is explaining is that basically if we're able to pay for things that we had planned on paying for out of general fund budget with this money, that will then free up that money to then be allocated, either spent or allocated however we feel most appropriate, which if in looking at our short and long-term needs from capital, we feel that it would be wise to invest in the capital reserve.
So in 24-25, we were already budgeting a $1.5 million deficit. So this would be about they gave us an extra for this adequacy, $3 million. So half of it covers our deficit and the other half possibly could be extra. We did, but if we don't have to tap into the fund balance and we use this instead.
I mean, keeping our fingers crossed that if they would put the money into basic educational funding and it would be something that we could rely on annually and sustainable, then we can look at that. We can't count on it. We can hope for, but we need to budget as if it's an uncertain, especially when we're budgeting before we really even know state allocation. And that is a challenge.
And from everything that I had heard in the budget meetings was the state had leftover ESSER money. And that's one of the reasons why I think they are hesitant to commit too far out into the future. It was a similar situation to what we had in 2009-10 with the American Recovery Act, the ERA money back when Obama was in, right after the stock market tanked in 2008. Well, he threw all this money at schools. We had millions of dollars. The state had a little bit of play with that. And that's when as I recall, that's what gave us the bump for 11-12. The money was there. They had to spend it. They gave it to us. But in the meantime, they had cut us by 4.7 the previous 2 years. So they cut us, gave it back, but we still weren't at the level that we were before. So it's just cautiously optimistic. But the last couple of years have been we have made out so very well. It's just, if you look at history, the first 5 years, we were on an upward trend before 2009-10, and we started losing money. And then that's also 2009-10 is when Corbett was a Republican governor, didn't really want to fund education. And these are my opinions, didn't really want to fund education. And you can see in that second over 5 years, we had a total decrease of $373,000 in that time period. Meanwhile, our PACERS rate was going from 4.78 to up to 16.93. So there's just a lot to take into account when we're planning forward and not get too excited and plan on it.
Any other questions?
All right.
Mr. President?
All right. Well, then I will accept a motion to adjourn this meeting. I'm looking for a second. Any questions? Anybody want to share anything before we adjourn?
You have a flyer at your table. This event is a joint venture between Altoona and Hollidaysburg. We've been implementing Rachel's Challenge at our buildings for a number of years now, and this is kind of a booster event. That's going to be a joint. They're going to be here with Altoona and Hollidaysburg on a 2-day period, but there's going to be a public event on the evening of the 16th here at the high school from 6 to 7. I will tell you from having experienced this presentation myself, it is one of the most impactful and moving presentations that I've ever been a part of. So if you're able to attend, this is going to be next Wednesday, 6 to 7 here at the high school auditorium. It is it's an amazing program. I think some of you have been in to see Rachel's Closet at different buildings and some of the initiatives that have spawned out of the Rachel's Challenge movement. It's a very big part of what we do here in the school district. And again, I think it's something that I hope our community embraces. Thank you.
Okay, all in favor of adjourning this meeting, please say aye. Aye, opposed?